Okay, so now we move down to the second element of the democracy standard, and that's the idea of political liberty. Political liberty is defined as the basic freedoms essential to the formation and expression of the popular will and its translation into policy. The idea of political liberty we have in our society, and that those can be impacted by government action and by other individuals. And so, in order, we need to have some important political liberties or freedoms. And so, what are these essential freedoms? One good place we can start is the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution. It was an important part of the Constitution, and we'll talk about that in Chapter 2. But one way of arguing what our political system says are those essential liberties you need to have in order to have the formation expression of the popular will and its translation into policy is the Bill of Amendments to the US Constitution. The First Amendment is the one that people often go to first, and they're called the Five Freedoms of the US Constitution. Those five freedoms are the freedom of speech or freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom to petition, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. And so each one of those makes a lot of sense in terms of ways in which they will, A, hopefully help our lives and be able to live the lives that we want, but also B, to influence government actions, to be able to participate in politics, to discuss the politics, to influence it. So all five of those would be listed in terms of the basic freedoms that are necessary in our political system. But there are other some important freedoms. Obviously, the Second Amendment of the US Constitution is a controversial one. We'll talk about it a little bit in this course. But we will also think about some of the other ones. For example, some of the freedoms we talk about are the freedom from illegal search and seizure, the Fourth Amendment protection, freedom against self-incrimination, you have the right to remain silent, which is in the Fifth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial in the Sixth Amendment, and the freedom from cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment. And so the Bill of Rights is not simply those first five freedoms of speech, religion, petition, assembly, and freedom of the press. It is also protections should we be charged with a crime, to make sure that we are treated fairly by the judicial system should we be charged with a crime, and if convicted of a crime, the Eighth Amendment says that we will unusual punishment. Other societies have a different list. If you think about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the list of freedoms that are listed there are quite large. That you have the freedom to vacation, or you have the freedom to move from one place to another. You have freedom of education and things like that. We do not have that explicitly protected in our political system. Some argue that we have the basic building blocks that will help to achieve those things. But it's important to recognize that the list of the essential freedoms is something that is debated in different societies and in different structures. Also, some things where we might think that there are things that are protected, or we would like to have them protected. So in our technological world, many would add to the idea of the right to privacy as an important freedom that we need to have and should have. It's not explicitly protected in the Bill of Rights, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about individual liberties in Chapter 15 later this week. And so some even argue because it is not in the Bill of Rights, our rights to privacy are not as protected as some of the ones that are actually listed out in the Bill of Rights. We're going to talk about that debate a little bit. But you can see that the can vary from societies to societies. There are different emphases in terms of which ones are most important. So along those lines, in the First Amendment, the five freedoms that are there of speech, religion, petition, assembly, and freedom of the press, there are some who argue that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, is considered to be the first among equals, is that all elements of the Bill of Rights are part of the US Constitution, and therefore all are the supreme law of the land and all should be protected. But there are many ways in which, taking a look at political history, taking a look specifically in the recent era, in the past 20 years, the US Supreme Court tended to place freedom of speech, freedom of expression as the core idea that our society is to protect. And so there are some who disagree with that and say that some of the other freedoms are not being protected nearly as much. Others argue that they are extending this freedom of speech to other entities, including corporations. We'll be talking about that a little bit later when we talk about the Citizens United ruling versus the Federal Elections Commission. So you can see that the debate, even though we can see and list pretty clearly what we mean about the freedoms and why those freedoms are important, exactly which ones are included, discussion. The third element is political equality. And political equality is the idea that each person carries the same weight of decision making. And so this is linked to the idea of one person, one vote. If you don't have that element, if it is that more money or Oprah, because she's more popular, get more votes than others, that's not a fair system, and it wouldn't be political equality, that would be unequal. But as the textbook points out, is that enough? Is political equality simply that need to be protected by the government to make sure that each individual carries the same weight in voting and other political decision making? Because if the actual decisions of government are not decided simply by the voting, other ways in which some interest groups, for example, can influence the actions of representatives in the House of Representatives and the US Senate, or they can influence the President of the United States, or they can bring to the courts and can influence the actions of the government, then one person, one vote doesn't protect against that. That we need to take a look at other elements, other institutions that are involved, but also take a look at other ways in which we are unequal. And so then the question is, how far do we go in terms of dealing with the social and economic inequalities that clearly have an impact on American life and American political life? The two questions of, can the government intervene to achieve these types of equality? And then even further, should the government intervene to achieve these types of equality? And we're going to be seeing that throughout the course, but particularly when we talk, we will be talking about the idea of political equality and other economic and social inequalities in our system and how they can influence political equality or inequality. So finally, we've gone through each one of the elements of popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality, and each one of those seems to be something that can contribute positively to an idea of democracy. We talked about the ways in which those are harder to achieve than we might first think when we talk about the definitions of those, of how much is involved in terms of getting popular sovereignty, what liberties exactly are going to be protected, and what level of intervention to achieve the political equalities that we think are important to have a democratic system. And so all of that is but there might be ways in which those three elements don't fit together neatly as we might first imagine. And so as we say on this last slide, the way in which these elements of the democracy standard are described, each one seems desirable. It seems something we look forward to and would say is something that contributes positively to our system, to our lives. And yet, there are ways in which these might conflict with one another. My background is, in addition to political science, is also economics, and so the idea there's no such thing as a free lunch. There are ideas in which there are opportunity costs, there are trade-offs that exist in any. And so I'm not going to take an economic viewpoint of this, but it does point out that we should at least think about the ways in which, even though things we value, things that are good, might not necessarily work together all that well. And so, for example, in the case that popular sovereignty conflicts with political liberty. As we'll be talking about when we talk about civil liberties, Benjamin Franklin and others have pointed out that a fearful people will often restrict the important political liberties. So, for example, in World War II, there was the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. It was instituted by government officials, but a majority of Americans and a majority of Californians, where a large number of these internment camps were created, supported the actions of the government. And so in that sense, the fear that there might be insurrection from Japanese and Japanese Americans who would be spying on the United States during World War II is one in which a majority supported an action that clearly limited political liberties of a particular group. That in that sense, you can see ways in which liberties and rights, liberties and equality might be, because in this majority was willing to impose costs in terms of taking away individual freedoms from a particular group, Japanese and Japanese Americans. You also have the example of the ongoing war on terror, the global war on terror, which is what the Bush administration tried to convince us to call it, is one in which, if made afraid, we are willing to say to the government, do whatever is necessary to make us safe. We're afraid. We don't want this to happen again. There might be important political liberties, whether that is there will be illegal search and seizures that violate the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution. Whether there is, again, placing people in Guantanamo Bay who, and not charging them with the crime, taking away their right to a speedy trial. All of those things were done in ways that are supposed to make us feel safer and got popular support. So when we can see the ways in which popular sovereignty and political liberties with one another. Another example is that popular sovereignty might also have some interactions with political equality. The majority does not always look out for minorities and less powerful in our society. That is something we're clearly going to be talking about when we talk about civil rights. The other example that the textbook points out, and we're going to be talking, marriage equality failed the first 31 times it was put in front of voters across the United States. There were a number of states that put the issue in front of the voters, and for the first 31 times, a majority of them, including California, said no, that they wanted marriage to be between a man and a woman. And so in that case, the majority, popular sovereignty, what the people wanted, went against the idea of political equality, saying that some people could get married and other people could not. Another example is the trade-off between political liberty and popular sovereignty. And that is the argument that protecting important freedoms has relied on the courts, the federal courts, which are the political institutions that are farthest from we the people. We've already talked about this, but we might as well say it again, and it might show up on the exam, so just be clear about this procedure, is that the judges are chosen the same way at the federal level. The president nominates the individuals who will become judges, and then they're in the US Senate. There is no role for we the people in making that decision, at least in any direct sense. And then, once appointed to the judiciary, the federal judiciary, judges serve for life. And that means they don't run for re-election. So that process, the institutional process of how the judges are chosen, is one in which we don't have much say. And so you could clearly say that violates the idea of popular sovereignty. But at the same time, we also have to take a look, as we talked about with substantive democracy, we also have to take a look at what the judges actually do. And if federal judges are there and their actions are ones that actually protect important political liberties by arguing that the government action violates someone's freedoms, and then those actions are unconstitutional, then the judges have acted to protect individual freedoms, even though there wasn't popular sovereignty. And so there are a number of examples that we could give, but it's just pointing out the fact that these three elements, even if we like them, might conflict with one another in important ways. And we need to recognize that. And it adds another layer of the struggles that are part of this wonderful thing we call American democracy.